So I recently enabled Markdown in my blog comments, and Markdown allows you to add formatting syntax to the comment text area. So for example, I could say this is bold and this is italics, and these asterisks and underscores will be converted into HTML tags like strong and EM, and this supports other things like paragraphs and list items. And one of the features that I really wanted to enable was fenced code blocks. So fenced code block is this idea of a triple backtick followed by some sort of language identifier, and then another triple backtick. And anything inside of these fenced code blocks, sandwiched on either side by the triple backtick, is a code snippet which will be formatted inside of a pre and a code tag. So I could do something like, div and div, and then eventually this would be formatted as HTML on the front end. Now, by default, if I'm in a text area and I do something like hit tab, you'll see that the focus goes from the text area to the button here. And if I do Shift+Tab, it'll go back, and Shift+Tab within here will focus something else. And that's what you want in a lot of cases, because you can tab your way through a particular set of form fields. But if you're editing code where tabbing is a real critical part of the usability of a code snippet, I want to be able to enable that in the actual text area. So as I showed here, if you're outside of these fenced code blocks and you hit tab, you go somewhere else. But if you are inside of a fenced code block and you hit tab, you can see that I am enabling the tabbing here. This is some cool stuff. And if I hit enter, you'll see it maintains the current indentation. Woot woot. I could do things like hit Shift+Enter, which will take me to the next line with the same indentation. Nice. I could even do something like I could select a bunch and I could tab and Shift+Tab, tab, Shift+Tab to change the indentation. And then here hit enter, and again, it's going to keep me at the appropriate place. So you can see here in the console that I'm actually overriding certain key events. And if we clear this again, if I'm inside the text area but not inside a fenced block and I hit tab, you can see no logging. If I go into the fenced code block and I hit tab, you can see here that we're overriding. So we're only going to be overriding keyboard events that are contained within the fenced code blocks. So let's take a look at how that works. So here's my markup. I have my text area and my button, and I have some JavaScript here. Grab the input from the DOM. I'm figuring out what the new line delimiter is for this particular browser. I'm having a tabber that I use tab, so you could theoretically also use spaces here, but I mean that would just be silly. And then I'm listening for the key down event on the input. So I'm actually listening for every single key down event on that input, but I'm only going to be overriding certain ones. And those certain ones have to adhere to certain conditions. One, is the keyboard event a relevant key event for these program-oriented, these code-oriented keystrokes? And that means that it's either like a tab, a Shift+Tab, an enter, or a Shift+Enter. But I only want to override those if I'm also within a fenced code block of the input. And if we jump down to the definition here, I get the input state, which just gives me this essentially the start and end selection. And I check to see if the selected value contains a backtick. So if I contain a backtick, meaning like let's say that I have a selection here that crosses over a tab boundary and I hit tab, you'll see that I don't override that because that's not a clear enough indication of what the user is intending. The second condition is that we then get all of the backticks pre or before the selected value, and I check to see how many there are. If there's an odd number of backticks, then it means that I'm currently inside of a fenced code block that has not yet been closed, right? If we come back here, if here's my selection, there are 0 backticks before it, 0 triple backticks, so I'm not inside a fenced block. If I'm here, I have 1 triple backtick before the selection, which means that I have an odd number of triple backticks, which means that I'm currently inside of a fenced code block. So if those two conditions are true, right, if it's a relevant key event and I'm inside of a fenced code block, at that point I want to go ahead and apply special meaning to those events on the input. And because we're applying special meaning, I want to prevent the browser's default behavior, which means for tab, I want to prevent moving from the current field to the next field. And for things like Shift+Tab, I want to prevent moving from the current field to the previous field. And then the applying event to the keyboard, that's where the meat of the logic is. I'm looking at the particular events. Is it a tab event, a Shift+Tab event, an enter event, a Shift+Enter event? And then for each of these, I'm simply applying special meaning to that. And these are just very logic intensive in terms of string manipulation. I'm not going to bother going through those. But ultimately, what happens is that I get the current state of the input, which again gives me the kind of the value and the selection. I change that state based on the key, and then I set that state back into the input. And if we look at what the set input state does, all it does is take that state value start and end and saves it back into the input for the value selection start and selection end. And that is how I have managed to enable tabbing and other kinds of special character recognition inside of the fence code blocks, but not outside of the fence code blocks, which hopefully I will add to my blog comments either today or tomorrow. So that's very exciting.